and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How can we get more ethical all up in this dev? Very excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce him, I want to make sure you know who the voices are on this podcast. I am, of course, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone, calling in from Wellington, New Zealand. And I'm joined today by Eriol, calling in from the other side of the world. Eriol has a last name. I think it might be Fox. I always forget. Eriol, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, I'm doing good.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that. And we're joined today by not one, not two, but three separate people, all of whom work on Ethical Source. Wait a minute. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah, it's pretty right. I hope it's right. We're going to find out.
Organization for Ethical Source is the group.
The Organization for Ethical Source. I was correct, and we know what's happening, and the coffee is flowing today, which Rynn doesn't need, calling in from California. That was Rynn Mancuso. Rynn, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. 3:00 in the afternoon. Leaves are changing. Excited to be here.
Amazing. If you want to talk to your friends about Rynn after this podcast, they go by they, them. And we're also joined by Maryblessing Okolie, calling in from Nigeria, where it is very hot and late. Maryblessing, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. It's past 12 a.m. my time, and I'm pretty sleepy, but I'm doing okay, and I'm excited to be here.
Excited to be here for Open and Ethical Source, which is great. We're also joined by McElaney. Mo is calling in from a library at an undisclosed location because I forgot to ask. Mo, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm calling in from frosty Vermont.
Oh, Vermont is the best. You're in Caledonia County or the NEK somewhere, correct?
No, I'm in Chittenden County, right on the lake, up near Burlington.
The lake is excellent. I lived in Montpelier for 5 years. Vermont has a special place in my heart. Amazing. Okay, so that is us today. And we're here not to talk about our names, although we could. They're pretty great names. We're here to talk about the Organization for Ethical Source. So which one of you would like to give me the 2-minute elevator spiel as we go up to the 27th floor about what the organization is and does?
Yes. So the Organization for Ethical Source was started by Coraline MK as a group to hold the work on the Contributor Covenant, which was the first project we did together, and the Ethical Source License, which was the second project we did together. And we'll be talking about the Contributor Covenant a lot on this call, but the Ethical Source License was a project to see if we could create usable open source license that gave maintainers more control over who was using their software and for what. And we did succeed in that, and we have some adopters, although the Ethical Source License, for a lot of reasons, poses some challenges to enterprise adopters. So it hasn't, and Mo maybe can talk about that a little later. It hasn't been super widely adopted, but it's good that we have the Hippocratic license out there. And it is something to kind of make a serious attempt to help people think through some of these questions, even if we haven't been able to get it widely adopted by foundations for the same reason. And so we have lots of other projects under the umbrella right now that are in various stages of incubating, and we'll talk a little bit more later. Mo and I are starting an AI project, and that's pretty much what OES is. And we've been around for, what, anybody know, about a decade?
I know that the Contributor Covenant came out in 2014, and I don't know if the Organization for Ethical Source was before or after.
You know, we should really know our own years, but yeah, I don't know either. OES, we founded it around the time that Coraline came up with the term ethical source, which happened after Contributor Covenant 2 and while we were working on the license.
Arguably, knowing exactly when things started isn't as important as the ethics of what you're doing. I would argue, like, it's more important, like, I think the meaning of what you're trying to get across. So I don't worry about not quite knowing which one happened first, for sure. But I'm really curious to ask about what your intentions and hopes for, like, the Hippocratic license is. This is out there in the world. You're doing lots of work around ethics in open source, what would you want the open source ecosystem to look like in however many years you can kind of expect things to happen with what you're working on?
So the Hippocratic license is separate from the contributor covenant, just to be clear. But it's an open source license, and the primary goal is to create some legal standing to ensure that people can't do bad things with your code that you're writing and open sourcing. So, it's a lot more than just that, but that is the goal of it. And then we could talk more about adoption and that kind of thing, but that's the basic premise. Do no harm. Modeling it after the Hippocratic license in the medical industry, healthcare industry.
I love this license. The Hippocratic license is amazing. It's one of my favorite things. You said something just there that I found really interesting. You said the Hippocratic license is an open source license. It is an open source license if you think about it as a big tent for all open source work that's kind of working in the open, where we're all agreeing that this is something. But according to the OSI, who have long been the de facto arbiters of what open source means, the Hippocratic license can't be open source because it limits downstream usage. And that's one of the things that violates one of the 10 principles of what open source is, only according to the OSI. Can you help me understand what you mean when you say open source if we're not using the OSI's definitions?
So yeah, it's a restricted license for sure. And so there is a lot of debate to be had around that. And that has had a direct impact on the adoption of the Hippocratic license, because if you're a small company and you have a tight control over who's using your software, who's using your open source project, then it's a lot easier. But if you're any enterprise, you probably have government contracts, and then that immediately starts to go into the realm of violating it. Yeah, OSI's definition would make it not an open source license, but we want people around the world to be able to have some control over their software not contributing to the destruction of the planet, the harm and genocide of human beings, that kind of thing. So that is the purpose of it. I guess technically it's not an open source license if you use OSI's definition.
Rynn, do you have something that you want to add to that?
Yeah, what I will say is Mo and I will come back a little later, perhaps, and talk about the new work that we're looking at in AI. But when the open source definition was initially sort of developed and refined back in 2006, technology and the world was a little bit of a simpler place. And we definitely were not thinking about the challenges that we now have with people, for example, using AI that requires enormous data centers that are being built for the most part in poorer neighborhoods or poorer countries. We did not have these problems. And so we think the work that the OSI has done is really great. And we also think that now we are at a critical juncture with technology and ethics where we do need to vary some of the parameters that we talked about early on when establishing open source.
What I'm hearing is, and I think this is a statement that could be spicy for people's opinions of me, but time changes things. Like the evolution of things happening in society means that we need to change how we're defining things, how we're building things, how we're responding to things. And a lovely little segue into the Contributor Covenant 3.0, which I believe is the most recent version that you've worked on. If you'd like to talk a little bit about what's changed there, what prompted the update, and what are the critical parts of that update that you'd like to tell the listeners?
So I am actually the only person in this group who came over from Contributor Covenant 2. I had been working at Mozilla and actually rolled out their enforcement system. Their enforcement system was interestingly not built in the open, and that was because we figured out in the process of doing it, it was very early in the time that kind of GDPR had just been passed. Folks didn't know everything about complying with it, and Mozilla was like, we're not sort of taking the risk of trying to host something that has to be GDPR compliant in the open. We ended up buying a Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a US financial act that requires folks who work with money to like be able to report when they are seeing like possible fraud or insider trading hotline, because that had all of the features we needed to be able to process GDPR requests to keep the data separate. And so I had designed Mozilla's enforcement ladder, which is really a procedural document in conjunction with a lot of other people, and put together this hotline system based on, tool that basically its front end was a web form. So I knew something about this, and Coraline brought me on to design an enforcement ladder as kind of appendix to Contributor Covenant 2, which we did, and to move into Coraline and I attempted to build an enforcement system in the open that is out there. It is called Code of Conduct Beacon. It is a little bit old. Coraline has just been dusting it off very recently and starting to install the Ruby upgrades and things necessary for somebody to run it so we can modernize it to work with Contributor Covenant 3 and hopefully get more interest in it again. I think we did it with the Linux Foundation, who were great and who contributed quite a sum of money to get it to go. And then I think everyone sort of went into the pandemic and lockdown, and codes of conduct and in-person events weren't the biggest consideration. And so that ended up getting put on ice. But what Coraline and I knew from Contributor Covenant 2 was that we had not done a good job because it was just the two of us, and we were both from America. We were both trans people who were often coded as women in tech spaces. And we were both white. And a lot of Contributor Covenant 1 was written to address the pains that we had and that people who we met at American tech conferences had with sort of being in person. It was a very limited scope, and we always designed it to sort of work on the internet and be for open source projects. But a big place that Contributor Covenant 1, which was written only by Coraline, came out of was that period in 2013 and 2014 when we were really setting up the women's meetups. We were really aware, and this was still a time when there were booth babes at tech conferences. That was like the thing that we had to try to stop. And so we knew that we hadn't done a good job of sort of making sure that we were taking care of the needs of all countries. And I'd gotten like some ideas about this at Mozilla because Mozilla has a ton of contributors from India and Southeast Asia. And something that we learned is, I would get these problems that really had to do with caste, but nobody would say anything about caste. They would say something like, oh, this code club, which in India, they often will meet in code clubs to do contribution on a Friday night or whatever. And your contribution might be a traditional code contribution, or it might be, I'm teaching someone how to use GitHub. I'm teaching someone who's come here who has never used open source before how to download and install Firefox. It could be something like that. And all of those things are seen as contribution. And so somebody would file a complaint and it would be something like, people from my neighborhood are not allowed at this code club. And I actually employed someone in India part-time to work out these complaints for me, who understood US social justice because she worked for a US nonprofit as well, and understood caste and could translate this type of problem. And so we realized that we really weren't addressing everything that we could be. And we got this feedback from our translators too, that like some of the language we used was very American, very tied to Western concepts of identity. And we knew that this was a key priority in remaking the Contributor Covenant. And then our second priority was dealing with AI. And I'd love to hear of Maryblessing. We brought Maryblessing on first because she is wonderful and incredibly competent and a new open source leader. And second, because she is from Africa, and it felt important to us to bring someone on to lead the contributor covenant work who is not from the US. And she's worked a lot with the translators, and I'd love if you talk a little bit more about how we answered those challenges.
Yeah, so I think to Erol's question on some of the updates that we had to the newest contributor component, and when I'm going to also get to your question as well. So Rynn already gave the whole history. I wasn't there when we all started the contributor covenant version 1 and 2, but when I came on board to lead the launch of the version 3, Colin had this cool idea to incorporate or fix all of the things that probably wasn't there previously, and some of which having a community-driven code of conduct, right? So we started off with actually hearing from the wider community, did one-on-one interviews, also surveys to get people's input and feedback on, and just to be sure that we are incorporating or including the real-time need of folks in open source, right? So we did that, got a lot of amazing feedback from both leaders, maintainers, and even community members from different parts of the world, including Africa. And this newest update is also one that emphasizes restorative justice. And also we were also keen in including, or rather using, inclusive languages in the newest version as well. Then, of course, on the translation part, we're still making progress with that, right? And some of the challenges currently is just pretty much time for people to commit to this, but we're making progress as regards to also bringing in African translation. And we are currently working around that, and things like getting funding to see if to even incentivize people to actually do this work. So that's where we're currently at with the translation at the moment. And of course, when we launched the version 3, we also did launch, it got a new look. The website got a new look. And one of the things we included was the CC3 builder, which was going to help make it easy for people to adapt the code of conduct, right? Because we wanted to meet people where they are, the maturity of their own community, their open source community. And even though it's not open source community, right? So people can easily walk through the builder and make modifications where necessary before they take the final version and include that on their websites or maybe their GitHub repository or wherever that would be hosted eventually. And yeah, of course, we're also working towards including resources for enforcement, resources for community moderators to effectively use the code of conduct, and also how to enforce it within their communities as well.
So I think it was a phrase that Rynn used, or maybe it was Mo, but you mentioned building in the open. And I think it sounds like this is a really fantastic project about building in the open and how to do that. It reminded me, as you were talking about how you worked across borders with Maryblessing and with different people in different places with different perspectives on how open source can be built differently than the kind of dominant perspective of Western Europe and the USA, which is, I believe, dominated the culture of open source for a long time. And there's this sort of unpleasant history that I'm roughly aware of free and open source software being built in Western Europe and the US, distributed to the underrepresented global majority, commonly kind of referred to as the global south, being distributed there to be used or bestowed upon. And I'm really curious to have you dive into some detail about what you discovered were the really meaningful, important parts of these kinds of collaborations. How can other projects learn from what you did in how to build in the open more collaboratively across borders?
So I think one of the best things about being involved with this version of the Contributor Covenant, I wasn't involved with the first two, but I was involved with the building of the Hippocratic license. And that's how I found out about this working group opening and the call for help. It was really an effort that people opted into. Everyone that got involved within it was really passionate about making tech and making open source specifically a safer place to work. And we wanted it to be a collaborative effort, and we were willing to wait for people to be available. So, we worked asynchronously, obviously, with docs and collaborative software and Slack and all that stuff. But if everybody couldn't make it to a meeting, then we didn't have the meeting. If we wanted the voices there who wanted to be there. And so there were periods of time where certain people dipped out and they said, like, please continue on without me. But we always had a consensus from everyone, I felt like. And it was just really special to have the ability to share any kind of perspective. We would be going in a certain direction and someone would say, like, well, we haven't thought about it this way, or we haven't thought about this community. And we would pump the brakes and do a rewrite. Anyone could step in and make an edit. And that came from our feedback as well. Every bit of feedback we got, we took it seriously. We talked about it, and weighing that against the feedback from other parts of the community to make sure that we had representation there. So it was really special. And I felt like I got to know the other people who were involved in it. I didn't really know anybody that well. It felt like a really good process. I hope that comes through in this version, that every word was deliberated, really.
Just wanted to say that it's worth noting that it took us like a year and 6 months to complete the entire thing, to most points of having to wait for people to be available, right? So it took us that long because we wanted to make sure that we are incorporating every feedback. We had about maybe 2 or 3 rounds of feedback, collecting feedback from people and really analyzing it. We had this whole spreadsheet having to go through each of the feedback one after the other. And it was really good. And it was one of the really amazing work I have been involved with so far. So yeah. Ryan, you want to chime in something?
One follow-up, we're talking about how we collaborated. Something that was also a deviation, I guess, from the standard way that people do open source, that is generally true of our ethical source projects, is that we do not do everything in the open on GitHub. One of the reasons for this is structural. GitHub is not great at document management. It's a very slow way to work if you have to commit every single thing and multiple editors can't be working at once. And we found that often being on calls and working together was the best way to move things forward and not get stuck in endless comments. But another reason that we do that is that Coraline in particular, and to some degree me, received a lot of harassment from groups on the internet that were frankly very invested in being able to cause trouble for a lot of people. It was very scary. And we knew that it didn't seem fair to invite people into a process that would result in them experiencing that same sense of unsafety, when the idea of the covenant is literally to prevent that sense of unsafety.
Very intentional. I think there's a lot to learn from how you've done things. And also, again, a controversial statement, though maybe not supposed to be, not everything should be open all the time, full transparency. There are a lot of good reasons for being very intentional with how you do openness and how you do transparency. But I'd love to circle back on something that was mentioned right at the beginning, which is about maybe not specifically the enterprise adoption challenges, but just generally the adoption challenges for people for the Contributor Covenant, and also other aspects of the work that you do. I'd love to hear more about like how you engage with people for adoption and what other people maybe listening could also do to help if they want to.
We did a lot of work around that in regard to building out our resources section, because challenges to adoption can definitely just be, this is my tiny project and it's only me. I don't have a team to help me enforce this. What do I need to do to have a code of conduct, to do it in good faith, in a way that I'm actually creating a safe space for people? And I'm not just adding a markdown file to my repo and calling it a day. That's one question. But then when you talk about the adoption of a code of conduct in an enterprise environment, I work for IBM, and we adopted this version of the contributor covenant for our sample templates for our repo in our public GitHub organization. You could say that's adoption, but it isn't the same style of adoption as, say, the OpenJS Foundation, where they have a committee of people who are committed to enforcing the code of conduct. In the IBM enterprise adoption of it, it's up to each individual project to decide how they're going to do that and how they're going to enforce it. So adoption, really, you have to define what adoption means when you're asking about what the challenges of adoption are, because it depends on the environment. And getting a corporation to adopt the code of conduct is really difficult.
Yeah, I was going to say, Rynn, is it okay to talk about the recent challenge I shared on the Slack? Yeah, so one challenge that we recently got was from a particular community that they have more of people from low-resource regions. And they were particularly concerned about, there was a line in a text in the code of conduct that talked about failing to create sources. And when we included that, we had the current use of AI in mind, right? And the particular challenge for them is that the argument is that for people from this sort of like region, AI has enabled them or helped them communicate a lot of their ideas better. So imagine a scenario where they had to say someone has violated a code of conduct just because they probably use AI to better communicate an idea that they had. Would you really say that that was a harm caused to the community if we start talking about repairing harm and enforcing that particular code of conduct? So that was a recent challenge that we had, and we started discussing on Slack as well. But thankfully, the code of conduct exists for people to be able to like modify it. Again, like to the point I mentioned, like depending on the community maturity level, we're able to like modify the code of conduct in a way that it best suits your community and your community members, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, and that sounds amazing. And I wish that I had hours and hours for each of like the three topics that we're here talking about, because it's not just contributor covenant. It's also about ethical source. It's just working in public. This is a really, really good conversation. And unfortunately, I have to start wrapping it down. Rynn and Maryblessing, you mentioned at the beginning that you really wanted to talk about some work that you're doing on AI. And I feel like you just touched on it a tiny bit. Is there any chance you could tell me a bit more about that work and maybe how people can get involved?
Sure. I'm going to touch on 3 ways you can get involved with some different OES projects, and maybe other folks will have more to say. First of all, Mo and I are in the early stages of considering how we could approach ethical AI and consulting with sort of folks who have been out in the field in various ways. Friend who's an open source lawyer who's taken an interest in this, friends at various corporations, because obviously there's so much conversation to be had in this area. And so that's a very early forming working group. And there was a lot of conversation when the OSI was doing their definition of open source AI, and not every possible concern got captured, nor frankly should it be by the OSI, because their desire is to safeguard openness, where our desire is to safeguard ethical engagement. And so we think that there's a lot more to say and would love to work with people on that. Another call, if you have corporate giving money, if your open source office has budget, it's the end of the year. Or if you personally want to give donations, you have some donation matching, or you perhaps can deduct on your taxes and your government has taken a little bit of a right-wing turn, you may choose instead to donate your money to the Organization for Ethical Source. We are a nonprofit, and that will pay for these translations that we'd like to have into other languages and including more people. And finally, I will say many of the authors, not just the folks on this podcast, are available for freelance work or consulting. And anybody else want to add anything to how you can help, how you can get involved with new OES projects?
Yeah, so if you wanted to join these efforts, you can go to the Ethicalsource.dev website, and there are links at the bottom to join and get involved. We have a pretty active Slack community with different work group channels, including the ethical AI one that Rynn had mentioned earlier. And we're still doing work on version 3 to help with the rollout. So if that's something you're interested in helping with, we still have meetings. I think we're meeting once a month now. We were meeting weekly for a while when we were really trying to get it out the door, but we've rolled that back a bit. So
yeah, I just wanted to also add, so the translations, we're also open to folks coming in, so translators to that local language. We're looking to partner and collaborate with native speakers to also get these translators. So if you can give in some few hours, a month, a week, I don't know, please come around and support as well.
Yeah, most of the folks we've talked to about translation have said that if you're a very fluent English speaker and very fluent in your home language and you're fluent in both technology cultures, that translation should be a project of a couple days for you. If you're in one of the countries that's going to have some downtime, winter holidays coming up, we can certainly set you up to do a little work over the holidays if that would be a good time for you. But definitely get in touch. We do have certainly languages that we want to prioritize, but we're interested in having any language, and all we'll need is, even if you speak the most obscure language, if you can find a second reader to read your translation for us, that's all we need.
That is close to my own heart. That is amazing. Excellent. That's actually a pretty good place to end and to wrap this up. Thank you so much. You know how to get involved. You know how to find more work. If you have any questions, you can go on to sustain.org and go to the podcast and find the links that'll be in the show notes for this, or you can just go to the Organization for Ethical Source at ethicalsource.dev. At the very end of the show, we have Spotlight, where we highlight other people's projects or things that we think are great that we want other people to basically share. Mo, can you share your Spotlight today?
my spotlight is just that I would love to see more folks get involved with this project and other projects through the Organization for Ethical Source. So thank you so much for having us on the show.
Super great. That's another pitch for the Organization for Ethical Source, which we'll let pass because it really is a pretty good organization. Rynn, can you share your spotlight today?
Sure. So first, I want to give a real shout out to the folks at IBM and Red Hat. We did feedback process for folks who had adopted Contributor Covenant 2, and many organizations gave a lot. And I'd love to thank everybody, Linux Foundation, CNCF, lots of people came in with lots of feedback, but particularly IBM and Red Hat came in really clutch with feedback on using it in the enterprise. And sometimes we were like, actually, we can't do this because this is going to impact single project maintainers in ways that you haven't expected, but they were great. And I'm going to give a shout out to something that I think is really great in learning the concerns that other people have in tech is to get engaged in your own community or over the internet in some kind of coding teaching program. And there's lots of these. I volunteer in person with Dev Mission. I volunteer over the internet to do interviews for folks who are either entering tech or who are leaving tech jobs that they've been in for like 20 years and entering this precarious market at Jewish Vocational Services in San Francisco. And I volunteer over the internet with people all throughout the US who are women or non-binary people, mostly marginalized in multiple other ways, who want to enter coding Tectonica. So those are 3 places you can start, but also like go find something in your own community and really start like learning about the challenges that people who don't work in high-paced tech companies experience.
Love that. Amazing. Thank you so much, Rynn. Maryblessing, do you have a spotlight today?
Yeah, I think I would like to spotlight all the amazing people that really helped to put together Contributor Covenant version 3. They made the whole things very seamless and easy, so it was really good working with them. So shout out to Rynn, Mo, and Dwight, Colin, Gerardo, Ben, and yeah, I think there were more people I missed, but yeah, shout out to each and every one of them. And yeah, of course, more people joining in to like support the work we're doing at the Organization for Ethical Source. And if folks will be around for first time, I might be there, so come say hi.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Eriol.
Yeah, my spotlight is a little bit of a shift away from maybe code of conducts, but I think they've got an excellent code of conduct. I'm going to spotlight the Securing Software Repositories Working Group from the OpenSSF, because I think they just do excellent work. And if you are interested in how your software supply chain for open source is secured, then that is the working group to join. Really amazing people there.
Thank you so much, Eriol. And you can find all of these links in the show note. My spotlight today is actually going back to COCs. I want to highlight a really fun paper. It's called The Paradox of Openness, Trans Experiences in Open Source Software. That's by Hannah Frulikaj, Nikki Stevens, James Howes, and Laura Davish. Sorry, Hannah, if I pronounced your name incorrectly. And it's just a really interesting paper about some of the stuff we've talked about today, about how codes of conduct seem like there's a paradox where we want to be open, but we can't be too open. And I just thought it was a really, really fun paper. And I enjoyed reading it this morning. So thank you so much, Hannah et al., for that amazing work. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast in general, Rynn, Mo, and Maryblessing, and talking about Ethical Source. If you've enjoyed this podcast, listeners, there are several things you can do. One, you can go to all the links that I mentioned. You can go to ethicalsource.dev. You can use the Code of Conduct version 3 builder, which would be excellent. Go to contributorcovenant.org. I believe it has a dash between contributor and covenant. You can also go to podcast@sustainoss.org and listen to this and find the show notes, and you can share them widely. Sharing is caring. Can't think of another fun thing to say, but definitely tell your friends about this podcast. We haven't recorded them in a while because we are low on funds, and it costs money to make this podcast. So as well as donating to the Organization for Ethical Source, you can also donate to Sustain OSS. You can do that on our Open Collective. That would be super, super cool. Make sure that Paul, our editor, gets money because he's the one who makes this sound good. It's not us. We don't even say anything. He just fills in all the words. And that would be really, really cool. You can also find us, of course, on Mastodon and Bluesky. And we have a discourse forum as well. Sometimes we post on LinkedIn, which is like the least bad of all the social networks that's like corporate. And that's, how it goes. It's kind of weird and sad. And besides that, if you have any thoughts, you can message Eriol or I. You could also email podcast@sustainoss.org. You can message me. I don't know why I overcorrected to like the nominative case for that pronoun. My bad. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for listening to the very end of this podcast. Rynn, Maryblessing, once more, thank you for coming on. Good luck with everything. Keep the great work up. Let's translate all the things. I wish I had a language to translate that into really snappily, but I don't. So excellent. Thank you so much.